The rain poured mercilessly from the darkening Montana sky as Nora James clutched her sodden travel bag to her chest, the stagecoach that had abandoned her already disappearing into the gray curtain of water. April 1873 was proving to be crueler than any month she'd experienced in her 22 years. Her carefully pinned hair now hung in dripping strands around her face, her blue traveling dress sticking uncomfortably to her skin as she stood alone on the muddy road, miles from what was supposed to be her destination and her future. The advertisement had seemed like Providence when she'd read it back in Boston. Hard-working rancher seeks educated woman of good character for marriage. Comfortable home provided. After her parents' deaths from influenza and the subsequent loss of their millinery shop to debtors, the prospect of starting anew in Montana territory had seemed like her only option. Now, as thunder cracked overhead and her hopes sank deeper into the mud beneath her boots, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. A horse's whinny cut through the drumming of rain. Nora squinted through the downpour to see a rider approaching, tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders squared beneath a slicker that glistened with water. Her heart quickened. Was it him? Mr. Thompson, the man who'd placed the advertisement and exchanged letters with her for 3 months? But as the rider drew closer, she realized it wasn't the same man from the small tintype photograph she carried. This stranger's face was leaner, more weathered, with eyes that seemed to assess her situation in a single glance. "Madam," he called over the rain, tipping his hat. Water streamed from its brim. "You're a fair piece from town to be standing out here." "The driver said this was where I was to be met," Nora replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "By Mr. Thompson." Something flickered across the man's face, surprise, followed quickly by what looked like anger, though not directed at her. "Thompson's place is another 5 miles west," he said. "And he's been gone 3 days now, headed to Helena for supplies." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "Gone? But he knew I was arriving today. We corresponded about it specifically." The man dismounted, his movements fluid despite his obvious height and strength. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps late 20s, with eyes the color of summer grass. "I'm Kieran Murphy," he said, his voice gentler now. "My ranch borders Thompson's. Mind if I ask who you are?" "Nora James," she replied, lifting her chin despite the rainwater dripping from it. "I'm Mr. Thompson's intended." Kieran Murphy's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mail order bride?" The bluntness of the term made her flinch, though it was accurate enough. "We've been corresponding for months. He sent for me." Murphy's jaw tightened. "Well, Miss James, I don't know what kind of man leaves his intended standing in the rain, but it seems that's what Thompson's done." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Night's coming fast, and this storm isn't letting up. My place is closest. You've got a roof now, if you want it just until Thompson returns." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you should," he interrupted, not unkindly. "There's a creek between here and Thompson's place that'll be flooding by now. Even if I could get you there, the house would be empty." He held out a gloved hand. "I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins. You'll be proper as Sunday church." Nora hesitated only a moment before practicality overcame propriety. She nodded and allowed him to help her onto his horse, settling awkwardly behind him on the saddle. "Hold tight," he instructed, and she reluctantly wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse began to move. They rode in silence for nearly 20 minutes, the rain pelting them relentlessly until finally, through the gray haze, Nora saw the outline of buildings taking shape: a substantial main house and several outbuildings, all sturdy and well-maintained. Unlike many of the rougher structures she'd seen from the stagecoach, Kieran Murphy's ranch spoke of permanence and prosperity. As they approached, a woman appeared in the doorway of the main house, her silhouette backlit by warm lamplight. "Mr. Murphy." "What in heaven's name?" The woman's exclamation cut off as they drew closer and she saw Nora. "Oh my stars, you're soaked through. Both of you inside this instant." Mrs. Wilkins proved to be a short, robust woman in her 50s with capable hands and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Nora of her late mother. Within minutes of their arrival, she had hustled Nora upstairs to a small but clean bedroom, provided her with a flannel nightgown and robe that had belonged to Mr. Murphy's sister when she visited last year, and promised hot soup and tea once Nora had changed. Left alone, Nora peeled off her sodden clothing and gratefully donned the borrowed garments. Only then, in the quiet of the strange room, did she allow herself to truly feel the weight of her circumstances. Mr. Thompson, the man she'd journeyed over 1,000 miles to marry, had forgotten her arrival, or, worse, deliberately abandoned her. She was alone in unfamiliar territory with nothing but a trunk full of hopeful bride's possessions and the rapidly dwindling funds sewn into the lining of her travel bag. When Mrs. Wilkins returned with a tray, Nora had composed herself, though her hands still trembled slightly as she accepted the steaming bowl of soup. Mr. Murphy explained about Thompson, the housekeeper said, her tone making clear exactly what she thought of a man who would leave his bride to be stranded. That man's never had the sense God gave a jackrabbit, if you don't mind my saying so. You know him well? Nora asked, taking a careful sip of the rich beef broth. Everyone knows everyone in these parts, Mrs. Wilkins replied. Thompson's not a bad sort, just careless. Never thinks beyond his own needs. She busied herself laying Nora's wet clothing to dry by the small fireplace. You'll stay here until he returns, of course. Mr. Murphy's already sent one of the hands to Thompson's place to leave word, in case he comes back early. It's very kind, but I couldn't impose. Nonsense, Mrs. Wilkins interrupted. Where else would you go? The nearest town's 20 miles away, and the only boarding house is run by old Mrs. Peterson, who charges double what it's worth and still has bedbugs from the last century. She patted Nora's hand. You rest. Things always look clearer in the morning. After the housekeeper left, Nora ate her soup and drank her tea, listening to the rain against the windows and the occasional low rumble of male voices from downstairs. Whatever Mr. Murphy thought of her situation, he'd offered shelter without hesitation. In a land where survival often depended on such acts of neighbor helping neighbor, perhaps it wasn't so unusual after all. The next morning dawned clear and golden, the storm having swept away to reveal a landscape so vast and beautiful it took Nora's breath away. From her window, she could see rolling grasslands stretching toward distant mountains, their peaks still white with snow despite the spring season. Closer at hand were corrals, a barn, and what looked like a vegetable garden just beginning to show green. Several men were already at work, their voices carrying faintly on the morning air. Mrs. Wilkins had laid out Nora's now dry traveling dress, and after washing up in the basin provided, Nora dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. The main part of the house was larger than she'd been able to tell the previous night, a spacious main room with a stone fireplace, simple but well-made furniture, and bookshelves that surprised her with their contents. Not just practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, but volumes of poetry, history, and classic literature. She found Mrs. Wilkins in the kitchen, kneading dough with strong, flour-dusted hands. Good morning, dear. Sleep well? There's coffee on the stove and breakfast kept warm in the oven. Mr. Murphy's been out since dawn, but he said to tell you to make yourself at home. Thank you, Nora said, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Wilkins poured for her. I was wondering, did you learn anything more about when Mr. Thompson might return? The housekeeper's expression softened with sympathy. Nothing definite. One of our hands rode over first thing this morning, but the place was still empty. Mr. Murphy thinks Thompson will likely be another 2 days at least. Nora nodded, trying to hide her dismay. 2 more days of imposing on strangers' hospitality, with no guarantee that her intended would return even then. The uncertainty of her position pressed down on her like a physical weight. I should find some way to make myself useful while I'm here, she said, straightening her shoulders. I'm quite handy with a needle, and I can help with cooking or cleaning or, you most certainly will not, Mrs. Wilkins interrupted, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits before Nora. You're a guest, not hired help. Though if you're truly desperate for occupation, I wouldn't say no to some assistance with mending later. These cowhands tear through clothing like it's made of paper. After breakfast, Nora explored the house and its immediate surroundings, careful to stay out of the way of the ranch work. She learned that the Murphy spread, while not the largest in the area, was well respected for the quality of its stock. Kieran Murphy had inherited it 5 years earlier when his father died, and by all accounts had improved upon an already successful operation. Around midday, she spotted him returning from the range, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Something about his confident seat in the saddle, the way he communicated with the men riding alongside him with just a gesture or nod, suggested a man comfortable with responsibility and command. When he saw her standing on the porch, he changed course and rode directly to her, dismounting with that same fluid grace she'd noted the day before. "Miss James," he said, removing his hat. The morning sun caught in his dark hair, revealing strands of copper she hadn't noticed in the rain. "I hope you're feeling better after your ordeal." "Much better, thank you," she replied. "Your hospitality has been exceptional, Mr. Murphy. Least I could do." His eyes, she noticed, were even greener in the daylight. "I sent word to town about Thompson. If he's still in Helena, he'll get the message that you've arrived and are staying here." "And if he isn't in Helena?" Nora asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since morning. Murphy's expression hardened slightly. "Then we'll figure that out when the time comes." He glanced toward the distant mountains. "I'm heading out to check the north pasture soon. Would you like to come along? Mighty good to see a bit of the country you've come to." The invitation surprised her. "I wouldn't want to slow your work." "No slower than riding alone," he replied with a slight smile. "Besides, Mrs. Wilkins tells me you've been pacing like a caged songbird all morning." Heat rose to Nora's cheeks. "I didn't realize I was so obvious." "Hard not to be, when you're used to city ways and find yourself suddenly with nothing but sky and grass for company," he said, not unkindly. "Give me half an hour to take care of a few things, and I'll have a horse saddled for you. You do ride?" "Yes," Nora said, grateful that her father had insisted she learn, despite her mother's protestations that it wasn't entirely ladylike, though perhaps not as well as Montana demands. "We'll take it slow," he promised, and there was something in his eyes, a warmth, an appreciation that made her breath catch unexpectedly. True to his word, 30 minutes later Kieran returned with 2 horses, his own powerful bay and a smaller, gentle-looking mare with a white blaze. "This is Daisy," he said, helping Nora mount. "She's got good sense and smooth gaits. Just give her her head if you're unsure. She knows these trails better than most humans." They set out at an easy pace, Kieran pointing out landmarks and explaining aspects of ranching that were foreign to Nora's Eastern upbringing. Despite her initial reservations, she found herself relaxing, even enjoying the vastness of the landscape and the clean, sage-scented air. "How did you come to be here?" she asked as they followed a creek that sparkled in the sunlight. "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you inherited the ranch, but were you born in Montana?" "No. My father came west after the war between the states," Kieran replied. "He'd fought for the Union, lost his farm in Pennsylvania to taxes while he was away, and decided there was nothing left for him back east. My mother had died when I was small, so it was just him and me and my sister Kathleen. We traveled by wagon train in '65 when I was 15. That must have been difficult," Nora said, thinking of the hardships such a journey entailed. "It was," he acknowledged. "Lost Pa's brother to cholera along the way. But once we got here," he gestured to the landscape around them. "Pa said he'd found where he was meant to be. Built the house, built the herd. Sent me back east for schooling when I was 17, but I couldn't wait to come home." "You went to university?" Nora couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Higher education wasn't uncommon for men of means, but it seemed at odds with her preconceptions of Western ranchers. Kieran smiled, a flash of white teeth against his tanned skin. 2 years at Dartmouth. Would have been 4, but Pa took ill. Came back to help run things and never left. He glanced at her curiously. "What about you? What brings a Boston lady all the way to Montana to marry a man she's never met?" The directness of the question caught her off guard, but there was no judgment in his tone, only genuine interest. "Necessity, primarily," she admitted. "My parents died last year influenza. They owned a millinery shop, but there were debts I didn't know about. Once everything was settled, I had very little left." She straightened in the saddle, not wanting him to think she was seeking pity. "I could have become a governess or companion, I suppose, but when I saw Mr. Thompson's advertisement, it seemed like an opportunity for a real home of my own, eventually. He wrote that he wanted an educated wife who could help keep the books for his ranch and perhaps teach any children they might have. Thompson can barely write his own name," Kieran said, his voice suddenly hard. "Someone else wrote those letters for him." Nora felt as though she'd been doused with cold water. "What?" Kieran sighed. clearly regretting his bluntness. I should have told you yesterday, but you were already so distressed. Thompson can read some, but writing's beyond him. He probably had the storekeeper or the schoolteacher in town draft those letters. But why would he? She broke off, realizing the likely answer. A man wanting a wife, but unable to attract one locally and might resort to deception to secure a mail-order bride. I see. They rode in silence for a few minutes, Nora struggling to process this new information. If Mr. Thompson had lied about something as fundamental as writing his own letters, what else had he misrepresented? The comfortable home he'd promised? His character and expectations? I'm sorry, Kieran said finally. I shouldn't have spoken so plainly. No, Nora said firmly. I'd rather know the truth, however uncomfortable. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Murphy. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Most women would be in tears by now. I've had my share of disappointments this past year, she replied. Tears rarely improve the situation. That earned her another smile. This one slower and warmer. You're a surprising woman, Nora James. They continued their ride, cresting a small rise that revealed a view of the valley below. A herd of cattle grazed peacefully, dark shapes against the green grass. That's the north pasture, Kieran explained. Best grazing on the ranch. We'll move them to higher ground next month when the summer heat starts to dry things out down here. Nora watched as he surveyed his land with obvious pride and affection. Here was a man who knew his purpose in life, who had built something meaningful with his own hands. The contrast with what she knew of Mr. Thompson, a man who couldn't be bothered to meet his bride or even write his own letters, was stark and unsettling. There's your answer, Kieran said suddenly, pointing to the horizon where a plume of dust signaled a rider approaching at speed. They waited, and soon one of Kieran's ranch hands pulled up his lathered horse. Mr. Murphy, got word in town about Thompson. Nora's heart quickened. Is he returning? The young cowhand glanced at her, then back to Kieran, hesitation clear on his face. Go ahead, Jim, Kieran instructed. Miss James deserves to know. Yes, sir. Well, seems Thompson left Helena 3 days ago, but he ain't heading home. Took the stage west instead. Station master said he was talking about the gold fields in Idaho. Said he'd struck it lucky and was off to make his fortune. The words hit Nora like a physical blow. Mr. Thompson wasn't coming back. He'd abandoned her completely, not even bothering to notify her that he'd changed his mind. Did he leave any message? She asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. For me, the cowhand shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. No, madam. Don't reckon he mentioned you at all. Kieran's expression had darkened to thunderous. That son of a... He stopped himself, glancing at Nora. Jim, ride back to town and wire the stage company. Find out where exactly Thompson was headed. And check if he's got any outstanding debts locally that folks are expecting payment on. Yes, sir. The young man wheeled his horse and galloped back the way he'd come. For a long moment, neither Nora nor Kieran spoke. The cattle grazed on, oblivious to human concerns. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the silence. I'm sorry, Nora, Kieran said finally, and the gentle use of her given name almost undid her composure. It's not your fault, she managed, blinking back the tears she'd just claimed not to rely on. I made a foolish choice, trusting a stranger. No, he said firmly. The foolish choice was his. Any man with sense would consider himself fortunate to have a woman like you come all this way to build a life with him. The unexpected compliment warmed her despite everything. Thank you, but that doesn't solve my current predicament. I'll need to find work, perhaps in the nearest larger town. There's no need to make hasty decisions, Kieran said. You're welcome to stay at the ranch until you decide what you want to do next. I couldn't possibly impose. It's not an imposition, he interrupted. We've got the room, and Mrs. Wilkins enjoys having another woman around. To be frank, Thompson's place wasn't fit for someone like you anyway. Barely more than a cabin, and he's let it go to ruin these past few years. Nora studied him, trying to understand his motivation. Why are you being so kind to me, Mr. Murphy? You don't know me at all. His eyes met hers directly. My mother died when I was 7. My sister and I were raised by our father, but he always said the hardest thing about heading west was knowing that if something happened to him, we'd have no one. Out here, people look after each other. It's how we all survive. He paused. Besides, I think I'm coming to know you, Miss James. and I like what I'm learning. The warmth in his voice sent an unexpected flutter through Nora's chest. Suddenly aware of how long they'd been alone together, she turned her horse back toward the ranch. We should return. I need to consider my options. Of course, he agreed, falling in beside her. Just remember, there's no rush. Montana will still be here tomorrow. The ride back was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the ranch buildings, Nora couldn't help comparing the neat, well-maintained Murphy property with what she now knew of Thompson's comfortable home. Perhaps Providence had intervened after all, sparing her from a worse fate than being abandoned in the rain. The next few days fell into a pattern. Nora helped Mrs. Wilkins with household tasks, insisting on contributing despite the older woman's protests that guests shouldn't work. She mended shirts for the ranch hands, organized the chaotic bookshelf in the main room, and even taught Mrs. Wilkins some new recipes from her mother's collection. Kieran was often busy with ranch work, but he made a point of spending time with her each day, showing her the new calves in the barn, teaching her to identify edible plants that grew wild on the property, or simply sitting on the porch after supper, talking about books they'd both read or sharing stories of their different upbringings. They discovered a mutual love of poetry: Tennyson for him, Elizabeth Barrett Browning for her, and on the third evening, he read aloud from Ulysses as the sun set behind the mountains, his deep voice giving the familiar words new resonance. "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world," he recited, and Nora found herself watching his face rather than the spectacular sunset, captivated by the passion with which he read. On the fourth day, Jim returned from town with news. Thompson had indeed gone to the Idaho gold fields, telling the station master he planned to strike it rich before settling down with any female. He'd also left behind debts at the general store and the saloon, with no indication of when he'd return to settle them. His place will likely be seized for back taxes before summer's out, Kieran told Nora that evening as they walked along the creek that bordered his property. He hasn't paid in 2 years, from what the county clerk told Jim. I suppose I should be grateful I learned his true character before marrying him, Nora said, trying to sound pragmatic rather than heartbroken. She wasn't mourning Thompson himself, how could she, when she'd never truly known him, but rather the future she'd imagined, the security she'd hoped to find. Definitely, Kieran agreed. Though it does leave you in a difficult position. He hesitated, then added quietly, I've been thinking about that. Something in his tone made Nora glance up sharply. Oh. He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The setting sun caught in his hair and beard, turning them to copper flame. I know we've known each other less than a week, but I feel. He broke off, then started again. I've never met anyone like you, Nora. You've faced disappointment with more grace than most people show in their finest moments. You're intelligent, kind, practical. Mr. Murphy, Kieran, he corrected gently. Please, Kieran, she amended, her heart suddenly racing. What exactly are you suggesting? He took a deep breath. Stay? Not as a guest, not as an employee. Stay as my wife. At her stunned expression, he hurried on. I know it's sudden. I know you came here expecting to marry someone else. But I hope you've come to know me a little these past days. To see that I'm a man who keeps his word, who would treat you with respect and kindness. Nora was speechless. The possibility had never occurred to her, though now that he'd spoken it aloud, she realized there had been signs the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wouldn't notice, the small gestures of consideration, the conversations that stretched late into the evening. You don't have to answer now, he added quickly. Take all the time you need. Just know that the offer stands. He smiled ruefully. I hadn't planned to do this quite so soon, but when I saw you standing in the rain that first day, something told me you were going to matter to me. I don't know what to say, Nora managed finally. This is so unexpected. I understand, he said. It's a lot to consider. Just promise me you'll think about it before making other plans. She nodded, unable to form more coherent thoughts as they walked back to the house in silence. That night, Nora lay awake for hours, her mind whirling. Was Kieran Murphy merely being chivalrous, offering marriage as a solution to her predicament? Or did he truly feel something for her, despite their brief acquaintance? And what did she feel for him? She couldn't deny her growing attraction to him, his intelligence, his quiet confidence, the gentle consideration he showed to everyone from Mrs. Wilkins to the youngest ranch hand. In many ways, he was everything she'd hoped to find in a husband, though she'd never expected to meet such a man in these circumstances. But could she trust her judgment? After all, she'd been wrong about Thompson, believing his written lies without question. The next morning, Nora woke early and slipped outside before breakfast, needing space to think. The air was cool and sweet with sage and pine, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten. She walked to the corral where Daisy stood with several other horses, and the gentle mare came to the fence at her approach, nickering softly. "What would you do?" Nora whispered, stroking the velvety nose. "Start over somewhere else, alone? Or take a chance here?" "Horses generally favor staying where they're well treated," came Kieran's voice from behind her. Nora turned, embarrassed to be caught talking to an animal. "I didn't hear you approach." "Early riser's habit," he said, coming to stand beside her at the fence. He was dressed for ranch work, his sleeves already rolled up despite the morning chill. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable yesterday. It wasn't my intention." "You didn't," she assured him. "You surprised me, that's all." He nodded, his gaze on the distant mountains rather than her face. "I meant what I said, Nora. All of it. But I won't pressure you. If you decide you'd rather make your own way elsewhere, I'll help however I can, money for the journey, letters of reference, whatever you need." The quiet sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. This was no calculated offer made out of duty or desire, but something more genuine, a hand extended in partnership, with the promise of deeper feelings that might grow in time. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "Why me? You could have your pick of women. I've seen how the storekeeper's daughter looked at you when we rode into town yesterday." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Lily Peterson has been looking at me that way since we were 16. It doesn't mean anything." He turned to face her fully. "As for why I can't fully explain it myself. There's just something about you that feels right, like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. When you talk, I want to hear more. When you smile, I want to be the reason. When you worry, I want to fix whatever's causing it." He shrugged slightly. "My father used to say that when you find the right person, you know it in your bones." I never understood what he meant until now. Nora's breath caught at the naked honesty in his expression. No one had ever spoken to her with such openness, such unguarded emotion. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to stay. Not as a guest, but as your wife." For a moment, he didn't move, as if afraid he'd misheard. Then a smile broke across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to breathtaking. "You mean it?" "I do," she said, surprising herself with how right the words felt. "I can't promise that I love you, yet we've known each other too briefly. But I respect you, and I enjoy your company, and I think that with time, love would grow naturally between us." "That's all I ask," he said, reaching for her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. The chance to build something real together. Nora smiled up at him, feeling as though she were standing on the edge of a great adventure. "Then yes, Kieran Murphy, I'll marry you." They were wed 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Mrs. Wilkins sniffling proudly in the front pew and the ranch hands cleaned up and uncomfortable in their Sunday best. The ceremony was simple, the celebration afterward lively with music from Jim's fiddle and enough food to feed half the county, courtesy of Mrs. Wilkins and the neighboring ranchers' wives who had quickly adopted Nora as one of their own. As Kieran led her in a dance beneath lanterns strung from the barn rafters, Nora marveled at the strange path that had brought her here, a stagecoach leaving her in the rain, a stranger offering shelter, and now a new life opening before her, rich with possibility. "Happy," Kieran murmured against her ear as they swayed to the music. "Very," she replied, and meant it. There would be challenges ahead, certainly the harsh Montana winters, the unpredictable nature of ranching, the adjustments of two independent people learning to share a life. But in Kieran's arms, with the stars bright overhead and the future stretching before them like the vast Montana prairie, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths: hope. "You know," he said thoughtfully as the dance ended, "I never did thank Thompson properly." "Thank him?" Nora asked, puzzled. "For abandoning me in the rain?" Kieran smiled, his hand warm at the small of her back. "For giving me the chance to offer you a roof and finding, In the process, that what I really wanted to offer you was everything I have. Spring flowed into summer, and summer into fall. Nora adapted to ranch life more easily than either of them had expected. Her organizational skills proved invaluable for the ranch's bookkeeping, which Kieran had always neglected. She planted an herb garden beside Mrs. Wilkins' vegetables, started a small flock of chickens for fresh eggs, and even learned to ride alongside the hands when extra help was needed with the cattle. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. What had begun as mutual respect and attraction blossomed into genuine love, expressed in 1,000 small ways. Kieran bringing her wildflowers from the range, Nora staying up late to mend his favorite shirt, the way they naturally gravitated toward each other in any room. At night, in the privacy of the bedroom that was now theirs, Nora discovered passions she'd never imagined, layers of tenderness and desire that left her breathless and wondering how she could have ever considered marrying anyone else. In September, news reached them that Thompson had returned briefly to his property, only to find it seized for taxes and most of his belongings sold to settle his debts. He'd left again within days, heading for California this time, according to the stagecoach driver. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd met you that day?" Kieran asked as they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Sometimes," Nora admitted, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But then I remember that if he had, I might never have met you. And that would have been the real tragedy." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I'm a lucky man." "We both are," she corrected. "Lucky, I mean." She took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen, still flat beneath her dress. "All three of us." Kieran went very still. "Nora, are you saying?" She nodded, smiling at the wonder that spread across his face. "Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday when I went to town. The baby should arrive in early spring." With a whoop that startled the horses in the nearby corral, Kieran lifted her from her chair and spun her around, his face alight with joy. "A baby. Our baby. Kieran Murphy, put me down this instant," she laughed, though she was equally delighted by his reaction. "The whole ranch will think you've lost your mind." "Let them think it," he said, setting her gently back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "I'm the happiest man in Montana Territory, and I don't care who knows it." That winter was harsh, with storms that howled around the sturdy walls of their home and snowdrifts that reached the windowsills. But inside was warmth and love and preparation. Nora sewed tiny garments while Kieran crafted a cradle of polished pine, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work. Mrs. Wilkins knitted blankets and dispensed increasingly dire warnings about what Nora should and shouldn't do in her condition, most of which Nora diplomatically ignored. On a clear, cold day in early March 1874, after 18 hours of labor that left Kieran pacing the porch like a caged mountain lion, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed her fighting spirit to all who could hear. "She's perfect," Kieran whispered, cradling the swaddled infant with such reverent care that Nora's heart seemed to expand in her chest. "Look what we made, Nora. Just look at her." They named her Catherine Elizabeth Murphy, Catherine for Kieran's sister who now lived in Denver with her own family, and Elizabeth for Nora's mother. She had Nora's delicate features, but Kieran's striking green eyes, and a determined set to her tiny chin that suggested she'd inherited both parents' stubborn streaks. Spring brought new calves, fresh grass, and the first tentative steps of the Murphy Ranch into sheep farming. Kieran's idea, inspired by Nora's comment that the wool could be valuable as the territory grew. Together they planned and worked, building on the foundation Kieran's father had established, making it their own. Letters came occasionally from Nora's few remaining friends in Boston, marveling at her new life and the happiness that shone through her words. "You must have known what you were doing after all," wrote her former neighbor, Mrs. Collins. "Though a mail-order marriage seemed like madness at the time, it appears to have brought you exactly where you belong." Nora smiled as she read the letter aloud to Kieran one evening as they sat by the fire, Catherine asleep in her cradle nearby. "She doesn't know the half of it." "You could tell her," Kieran suggested, his fingers playing idly with a strand of Nora's hair. "About being left in the rain, about my gallant rescue." She laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby. "And give her more fodder for gossip? I think not." She folded the letter and set it aside. Besides, some stories are too precious to share widely. This one is ours." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And a fine story it is, though the ending keeps getting better." "It's not an ending," Nora corrected, settling against his chest with a contented sigh. "It's a beginning that keeps unfolding, day by day." Outside, the Montana night spread its star-spangled canopy over the ranch that was now truly home, not just a roof over her head, but the place where her heart had found its mate, where her future had taken root and flourished beyond anything she could have imagined when she stood alone in the pouring rain just 1 year before. As years passed, the Murphy ranch prospered. Catherine was joined by two brothers, James, born in 1876, and William in 1878. The children grew strong and lively, raised with their father's love of the land and their mother's appreciation for beauty and learning. Nora established a small school on the property, teaching not only her own children, but those of neighboring ranchers and the ranch hands who wanted to improve their reading and arithmetic. Kieran expanded their operations thoughtfully, always building with an eye toward what would sustain the family for generations to come. By 1880, the Murphy name was respected throughout the territory for fair dealings and quality stock. When Montana moved towards statehood later that decade, Kieran was among those asked to participate in the Constitutional Convention, an honor he accepted with characteristic humility. Through it all, their partnership remained the bedrock of their success. They disagreed at times, Nora's Eastern sensibilities occasionally clashing with Kieran's Western practicality, but they faced each challenge together, stronger for their different perspectives. On their 10th anniversary, Kieran surprised Nora with a gift she'd mentioned wanting years earlier, but had since forgotten: a piano, transported at great expense from St. Louis. The ranch hands had secretly helped him position it in the main room while Nora was visiting a friend in town. When she returned to find the gleaming instrument waiting, her eyes filled with tears. "Kieran, it must have cost a fortune to bring it all this way." "Worth every penny to see your face right now," he replied, drawing her close. At 40, he was still as handsome as the day they'd met, though his beard now showed touches of silver and lines fanned from the corners of his eyes evidence, Nora thought, of a life lived fully in sun and wind and joy. That evening, after the children were asleep, she played for him simple melodies remembered from her youth, songs her mother had taught her. Though her skills were rusty, the music filled their home with a new kind of magic, and when she finished, Kieran's eyes shone with the same wonder she'd first seen when she told him about Catherine's impending arrival. "I fall in love with you all over again every day," he said, sitting beside her on the piano bench. "But especially today." Nora touched his cheek, her heart full to bursting. Not bad for a mail-order bride left in the rain. He captured her hand and kissed the palm. "Best day of rain in Montana history, if you ask me." Years continued to pass, each bringing new joys and occasional sorrows. They lost Mrs. Wilkins to pneumonia in the harsh winter of 1888, mourning her as the family member she'd become. Catherine grew into a beautiful young woman with her father's head for business and her mother's compassion, eventually marrying the son of a neighboring rancher and settling on adjoining land. The boys followed different paths, James taking to ranching with his father's dedication, William showing an aptitude for medicine that led him to university in the East. Through it all, Kieran and Nora remained each other's constant partners, lovers, best friends. They weathered economic hardships, harsh winters, and the changing landscape of Montana as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. The railroad came, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Automobiles began to appear, though Kieran stubbornly preferred his horses until the end of his days. In 1913, 40 years after that rainy day when fate had brought them together, they sat on the same porch where they'd shared so many sunsets, now surrounded by grandchildren playing in the yard. Kieran's hair had turned fully silver, and Nora's once auburn locks were streaked with gray, but their eyes still held the same light when they looked at each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thompson had met you that day?" Kieran asked, echoing a question from long ago. Nora smiled and took his hand, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of decades together. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Some things are meant to be, rain or shine." And as the sun dipped below the mountains they both loved, casting golden light across the land they'd nurtured together. Nora James Murphy knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home that stormy April day, not in a place, but in the heart of the man who had offered her a roof when she needed it most, and then given her the world.